Well, Invincible Season 3 has come and gone, and damn what a season of television it was, with varied opinions regarding it. Personally, I thought that Season 3 rivaled the quality of Season 1, and despite what I felt might have been some pacing issues, really delivered when it mattered most. If you've been following my thoughts all year, you know how I feel, but if not, good news, this video is all of my weekly breakdowns from Invincible Season 3 strung together in one place so you can get all of my analysis. If you've already seen them, thanks for following along, maybe listen one more time if you feel like it, and if you're new, welcome. I love Invincible. I have some other videos about it too, and enjoy my Season 3 breakdowns. Invincible is one of my favorite shows on TV, and last year I had a ton of fun analyzing Mark and Nolan's beautifully written, inversed but parallel arcs through the first two seasons. Still very proud of that as my first Invincible video, but this year I decided it's definitely time to start covering the show week by week, and what a start to Season 3 with this 3-episode premiere. Honestly, there might even be too much stuff happening through the first 3 of the season, but there is so much to talk about, so let's take off. Heads up, this video will be filled with spoilers for the first 3 episodes of Invincible Season 3, but we'll be breaking them down one by one, starting with 301, You're Not Laughing Now. So right off the bat, this season is fully picking up where the previous left off. If you recall, at the end of Season 2, Mark was struggling immensely after he lost control and killed Angstrom Levy, after Levy threatened his mom and brother. This ultimately led to Mark's decision to stop going to college and lean into being a superhero full-time, so that he could really learn to hone and take control of his abilities, to prevent himself from going off the deep end again. And so we start off with a full-on training sequence and montage, showcasing that Mark has been taking this very seriously. Cecil and Donald have him fighting massive, powerful beings, withstanding volcanic eruptions, lifting glaciers.
So that was the heaviest thing we could find for Mark to lift, and he just lifted it.
They outright say that Mark's strength has now increased 138%. But as this episode in the season continues, the show does a great job revealing that Mark's control of his abilities weren't really the issue. It's more so his control of his emotions. We'll touch on that a lot by the end of this episode. It seems like a major focus of the season. The other seemingly huge aspect of this season is Oliver's growth and development. I will say, as far as pacing goes, this story feels like it's maybe moving a bit quicker than I would have wanted or expected it to, though obviously Oliver grows at an accelerated pace, so the story moving quickly kind of works thematically with the character. But within the first 15 minutes of the season premiere, Oliver reveals that he's already gotten his powers right after Mark promises he'll train him as soon as he gets them.
Too late! You promise!
On top of this, Mark is grappling with what he should do in regards to his feelings for Eve, feeling like he owes it to her because of the future Eve he met at the end of Season 2. We saw how difficult it was for Mark to balance anything resembling a healthy relationship with his hero work, and so it maybe feels like a bad time to just jump into another relationship, though the obvious difference here being that Eve is also a superhero. So basically, this is all a lot to take on at once for a pretty young superhero. Mark is now carrying the burden of training specifically to protect Earth from the inevitable Viltrumite assault. He's trying to form a new romantic relationship with an old friend, and he suddenly finds himself basically needing to not only train his younger brother, but be a surrogate father figure as well. And obviously the revelation that Oliver has powers wasn't just a big deal for Mark and Debbie. Of course Cecil wants in too.
This, Donald. You should have led with this.
Honestly, this premiere does a ton of great work setting up the stakes for the season, and even just on their own, Mark's new training regimen, Oliver's power development, and the potential Eve relationship are all pretty huge pieces of the story. But I think beyond the plot of it all, the really smart thing this season seems to be doing immediately is showcasing the difficulties Mark is having emotionally coping with all of these things happening at once. The first mission we see this season is with Rex, trying to stop these dudes from stealing the Declaration of Independence. This mission is interrupted by Multi-Paul, Duplicate's brother, who's seeking revenge on Rex for Kate's death, which obviously wasn't really Rex's fault, but Mark's reaction to Paul's assault here is, well, it's a lot. Not only does he just go absolutely nuts, tearing apart all of Paul's duplicates, but he insists on taking Paul to prison immediately, even after Kate shows up with the Immortal and reveals that she's still alive. Okay, a few things here. One, I feel like the reveal to the other characters that Kate is alive came kinda quickly. We only just learned that she was alive in the Season 2 finale, and within 10 minutes of the Season 3 premiere, everyone else knows too. I think I just have to get used to the fact that the show is paced really quickly, but it feels like nearly every single character death we've seen so far has been undone within an episode or two, and I do think the emotional toll these things take on the characters are still effective. It's just hard to trust anything as remotely permanent in this show since it's constantly undermined almost immediately. immediately. Secondly, Mark's emotional state is seemingly leading him to go like full cop mode this season. He is just stubbornly by the book and not really allowing himself to feel any empathy towards the people he's dealing with.
I don't care if he's your brother. He's going to prison now.
This definitely feels like a big departure from the Mark of seasons past. I mean, I cannot imagine old Mark just ignoring a reunion with Kate and feeling nothing towards her reunion with the brother who thought she was dead. And this attitude seems to be permeating every part of Mark's life this season. All of these setups converge in a massive battle at the end of the episode as Doc Seismic escapes from prison and uses an army of underground monsters and bugs to kidnap literally every earthly hero except for Mark and Eve. I have a lot of thoughts about this seismic fight beneath the Earth's crust. Doc Seismic is obviously a lot more formidable than we last saw him, and while I totally get that the entire point here was that this was supposed to be a nearly insurmountable challenge that forced Cecil to show off some of his assets before he wanted to, I think that it maybe felt like Mark got his ass kicked too handily here. The entire opening of the episode was spent showcasing how much stronger Mark has become, making a specific point to say that he's now 138% stronger. And then, when a real threat shows up, it doesn't feel like he really puts up any kind of a fight at all. I like the idea that Mark loses here, and that Cecil calling in Sinclair's Frankenbots and Darkwing causes a major conflict, but after telling us Mark is so strong, it was weird to see him just barely hold his own at all. But I digress. I do think that the results of this battle are really interesting, and they highlight what seemed to be the big moral dilemma for this season, which is kind of just about the nature of morality. Doc Seismic effectively beat everybody, and if he had been able to continue, every single superhero would probably be dead. Every one of them. Cecil obviously wasn't going to let that happen, and so he utilized assets that aren't necessarily on the up and up, continuing to use Sinclair's Cybots, and even putting Darkwing into action, even after he'd been apprehended for being willing to murder people on the job in Midnight City. And sure enough, Cecil's decision to use these assets saved everyone. If they had not been utilized, the world could have been irreparably damaged and completely defenseless. But Mark doesn't seem to care about this fact. He's incredibly set in these stubborn black and white ways, and he absolutely goes off on Cecil for daring to do something this morally dubious. And I think this is the sweet spot where Invincible operates best, showcasing these heavy superheroic scenarios that are not necessarily black and white in their solutions. Sure, Mark has the moral high ground here. He thinks Darkwing should be in prison, but also if Darkwing was in prison, Mark would probably be dead, alongside every other hero that keeps the planet safe. And Mark's attitude here is a really interesting evolution from where he ended in season 2. He was so terrified of becoming his father, so terrified that he would unknowingly walk down the same path Nolan did, and this has seemingly led to this staunch mindset in season 3. He refuses to budge in his ideals, in the things he believes are the right things to do. But by demanding that everybody play by his rules and by his moral code, Mark is actually portraying a pretty authoritarian attitude. He won't listen to any of his peers, he won't discuss the dilemma with Cecil, he tries to force his opinions on everybody through violence and force, which is ironically, of course, very Viltrumite. It's continuing this journey where Mark's desperation to avoid becoming his father is sort of inching him closer to being like his father. A real bummer. Cecil tries to explain to Mark that rather than locking up these people and throwing away the key, they can rehabilitate them for the greater good. And to his credit, this was proven to have been successful just moments before this when they saved Mark's life. And there's a particular irony here in that Mark's attitude has been spurred on by what he sees as his own moral failure. He's saying that these people can't help because they've murdered in their past, while he justifies the life that he took. Yeah, this is something that deeply weighs on him and that he deeply regrets, but he won't extend the same grace he gives himself to any of the other people in question here. And while it's clear that Cecil isn't the most trustworthy or moral individual, I do think it's really interesting to look at what his job requires and what the stakes are, particularly after essentially a massive failure in how they handled Nolan and were blindsided by his full-on betrayal. This premiere episode ends with Cecil basically surrounding Mark with his reanimated cyborgs in fear of what Mark is capable of and where he's headed.
Protection from what?
From you, Mark. From you.
And this is a great time to transition over to episode 302, A Deal with the Devil. Spoilers ahead for that one, and rather than picking up precisely where it left off, 302 flashes back to Cecil's agent days, before he had his role as director of the GDA. And in a pretty ingenious structuring decision, this flashback basically showcases how Cecil formerly held ideals and an attitude that were identical to what we've seen from Mark this season, actually showing us the very mission where he received his iconic facial scar. Cecil faces off against this pair of cultist wannabe revolutionaries called the Order of of the Freeing Fist, who attempt to use this chemical agent to destroy everyone within the city. Or maybe destroy isn't the right word, it's more like
that fog that turns people inside out.
Damn, The Simpsons is even predicting Invincible now.
Just one sniff of that fog and you're inside out.
But Cecil manages to stop the worst imaginable outcome, which would have seen thousands of lives lost. However, 17 innocents were still taken out, which Cecil takes incredibly personally, also informing the reality behind Cecil's scars, which he actually chose to leave on his face.
It's a reminder that I messed up, and to never let it happen again.
It then flashes a bit forward to another incident where Cecil and Director Radcliffe are nearly killed by this massive hulking threat. The only thing that saves them, much to Cecil's chagrin, are those same rehabbed Order of the Freeing Fist dudes, the ones who killed 17 and nearly killed thousands. Maybe it's a little on the nose, but obviously they're showcasing how Cecil formerly had a full zero-tolerance attitude towards this kind of rehab, and I mean zero tolerance. He absolutely blows them away.
I don't work with criminals.
This leads to Cecil's imprisonment, a really fascinating development in our understanding of his history as a character. They basically reveal that as a prisoner, Cecil changes this place from one of the most dangerous prison blocks you can imagine into a flawlessly run, clean, well-behaved haven of rehabilitated prisoners. This is a pretty interesting backstory for Cecil's own change of perspective and ideology, and it's exactly what earns him the job as the next director of the GDA, even after being imprisoned for murdering a pair of criminals in accordance with his own ideals.
I told you before, I don't waste talent, I fix it.
Cecil effectively had this zero-tolerance policy towards the idea of working with rehabbed criminals in this space until he literally found himself getting the director position because he himself was a rehabbed criminal in this space. And this really makes me wonder if we're going to see Mark fall even further before he has to learn this lesson himself as well, or if he'll just go a completely different direction and prove Cecil wrong. We'll see. After this great parallel backstory, we jump back to the end of the season premiere to Mark and Cecil facing off in that white room, and I really love the questions Cecil is posing here. Mark is stuck in this incredibly self-righteous mindset that is leading to some of these more authoritarian tendencies that I mentioned before.
You threaten people who disagree with you.
I don't threaten.
No? Because you're scaring the shit out of me right now.
I really like the idea that Mark is going to have to reckon with the reality of his power dynamics in this world, because he is effectively the most powerful person on the planet, meaning that there is always an imbalance with nearly everyone he interacts with. And so while he doesn't see himself as being threatening here, the fact that he is furiously angry, won't back down, raises his voice, etc., would be incredibly threatening to anybody who understands his abilities, further proven by how thoroughly he dismantles the Reanimen. But I don't want to come off like I'm fully defending Cecil here. I think the show just does a great job operating in these gray territories. The reveal that Cecil implanted an internal earpiece in Mark to incapacitate him is a major breach of trust, obviously, but of course it's also sort of hard to blame him based on everything that happened with Nolan. Again, those gray territories. But this breach of trust also leads to what I think is one of the other biggest and most interesting developments this season. It leads to most of the Guardians of the Globe turning on Cecil as well. Seeing what Cecil was willing to do to try and control Mark, they fully question if he's someone they can actually take orders from. The Guardians ultimately choose to help Mark, though I do think after they block the signal and recapacitate him, his violent retaliation scares even them.
And if you ever come near my family again, I will kill you.
There are so many interesting aspects to this entire part of the story. The last time the Guardians' headquarters was this ridden with blood and viscera was when Nolan killed the former Guardians of the Globe. Maybe a comparison Mark wouldn't be willing to hear, but again, one we should be making. Another example of how by desperately trying to be different than his father, Mark is unwittingly acting more and more like him. But I also found the new Guardians' disillusionment with the establishment to be really fascinating and well plotted. Basically, the moment they saw what they felt was clear corruption and overstep towards someone they trusted, the younger members of the Guardians all decided to bail. They couldn't work for Cecil in good conscience, but there's this interesting generational divide where the old guard members of the Guardians all kinda understand where Cecil is coming from and pin much more blame on Mark. This conflict is basically what sends the young members packing.
It's a privilege and an honor to work here!
This is for sure a difference in attitudes we see between older and younger generations these days in the real world as well, and I really appreciate the way they've transposed it split into this superhero world. A lot of older folks see their positions and job stability as a privilege. They maintain a pretty old world, if I do right by them, they'll do right by me mentality, which sadly I think is a bit divorced from the realities of our actual modern society, where corporations will throw people under the bus at a moment's notice if it means their profit margins increase. But the Immortal is the perfect character to represent this old mindset, as basically the oldest fashioned member of the cast possible, preaching that their position is an honor despite the obvious breaches in trust that they've seen with their own eyes. He's willing to give the GDA and Cecil the benefit of the doubt because that's what comes with the prestige of being a guardian of the globe. But the younger members are not willing to let those things go unchecked.
I'd rather quit than work one more day with a hypocritical prick like you!
Did I mention I love this show? This is good stuff. And all of these changes lead to more dubious decisions by Cecil, particularly putting Darkwing on the Guardians of the Globe again despite his history, something that not even Donald is so sure about. And that's something I really appreciated seeing, that this season seems to have nearly every character weighing these decisions on a moral scale, weighing whether or not they can let these things slide because of the stakes. I think this question is thrown even more up in the air with the last couple of sequences of this episode. Another flashback to Cecil's first encounter with Nolan, revealing that even back then, Cecil did not believe that Nolan's motivations were as righteous as he claimed they were. However,
As long as he saves lives, I don't give a damn about his motivations.
given how things ended up with Nolan, I think it's pretty easy to question if this mantra was the one worth following. Nolan saved lives for years before causing some of the most immense destruction and taking countless lives himself. But this last line from Cecil really illustrates how he sees himself and the role he sees himself take on in all of this.
We can be the good guys, or we can be the guys that save the world. We can't be both.
Damn, I expect this show intends to fully interrogate this idea. I mean, can these characters actually save the world while being entirely righteous? Can they protect everyone on the scale that is necessary without putting their foot over the line at all? Obviously, I hope the person this is explored through is Mark, and I expect it will be, but we'll see. Speaking of Mark, the other major development in this episode is that he does decide to fully move forward with a relationship with Eve, convincing her that they should be together despite her reservations, which, after the insanely traumatic event with Cecil, to me, feels like maybe not the move at this time. I mean, homie cannot be properly emotionally regulated. And maybe this is a good time to move into the last premiere episode, 303. You want a real costume, right? So more spoilers ahead for this one. And man, this is such a great episode. Where the first two felt like real continuations of one another, this one kind of moves past those events a tiny bit, but it starts with one of my favorite sequences in maybe the entire series. This entire opening decides to completely forgo dialogue, just showing these silent events set to the beautiful score. And it's another great example of how the Invincible universe tries to examine its subject matter from all angles. We basically see life from the perspective of these two criminals over a relatively long period of time, starting with an attempted bank heist that's foiled by Bulletproof. But even in this initial heist, they show one of the criminals' softer sides, how he makes a point to protect the citizens from the damage and fire at the bank, how he regrets the trauma he's causing this child, and after it's foiled, the pair's seeming devastation. We see their piled up bills in the small apartment they share, how the taller one's powers flare up when he gets emotional, and you really get a sense of how much these guys are struggling. And even after trying to play it straight and getting a service job, their rent increases, and then those emotionally flared up abilities cause them to lose that job as well, leading to their eviction. I love the way this show is willing to explore these different perspectives. This poor guy who was probably born with or gained these abilities against his will now has to try and fit into a normal society that doesn't really allow for the kinds of variables that come with his abilities. This is a couple who tried to do things by the book and were completely at the end of their rope. Their circumstance prevented them from holding down a regular job, and going straight caused them to become homeless. They're only committing these crimes to try and survive. And it's such a smart way to connect to the themes of morality that the season is exploring, particularly with how it seamlessly transitions into a fight sequence where Invincible and Oliver foil their last attempted heist. Mark is a character who has been so staunch in his belief of right and wrong in this season, and yet his superhero work in this sequence is fully harming marginalized folks who have been chewed up and spit out by the system. It's just a great opening. And I think the other really smart thing that this season is doing is that it's somewhat confronting Mark's stauncher beliefs through his younger brother. This episode is largely about Mark and Oliver, and particularly about Oliver's development as a quote-unquote hero, or maybe a villain. Obviously, it was super expected that Oliver developing his powers so early would cause problems, but I didn't expect them to hit so majorly and so quickly. But I really really love what this episode is doing with Mark and Oliver's relationship. As a fan of those kinds of sibling bonds playing out on screen, I really liked seeing them train together and Mark taking Oliver to get his first suit from Art. Of course, until he wants to call himself Kid Omni-Man.
Oliver, Dad did terrible things here. Things people aren't going to forget anytime soon.
Honestly, this is a part of the story so far that is the most painful to watch for me. It sucks to see such a young kid falter in such major ways. Oliver refuses to listen to his brother, which comes to a huge breaking point at the end of the episode after the Mauler twins incapacitate the entire Guardians of the Globe team. While Mark has to stop a literal nuclear missile, Oliver straight up murders the Mauler twins with absolutely no remorse.
That's what happens when you're a bad guy.
This shit is scary, and even scarier is that he straight up lies about not meaning to kill them. It's very clear that he intended for them to die, not to mention some of the things that Oliver says to Mark as he's trying to get it in his head that he's wrong about this.
You act like you know everything, but do you ever think that maybe Dad was right?
I have seen a lot of harsh reactions to Oliver here, which is obviously super understandable given, well, everything about this episode, but I've also seen a lot of people be pretty insistent that at the end of the episode here, Oliver is basically just lying through his teeth so that he doesn't get in trouble, and personally, I don't quite see it that way. That isn't to say I don't think Oliver might not be a big problem down the line, but I think we really have to take into account that this is a child. Kids have very black and white and often selfish points of view, and while I, again, do think this is going to continue to be a problem, his reaction to Debbie here does not read like a kid who's just lying to me.
Do you think my life isn't precious? Would you care if I died?
Of course I'd care. I don't want you to die. I love you.
I don't think Oliver is a good enough actor for this genuinely shocked look on his face to be faked. He's a kid, and I really don't think he considered this point of view in regards to Debbie. I fully believe that he loves Debbie and Mark, and so for me, I do think that there's hope for Oliver, maybe down the line, even though it is clear he's going to be an issue, and it will probably get a lot worse before he comes around. But we will see, and please don't spoil parts of the comics for me in the comments. I'm reading through after I watch the show each season. But I think besides this just being a great dramatic dilemma, that Oliver's more black and white viewpoints are such a great way to challenge Mark's attitude this season. Being forced to basically father this kid is a really smart way for him to confront his own black and white viewpoints, even if they obviously aren't one-to-one views. But I think it really could help him see that there's more to all of this than just good and bad. There are tons of other developments in these first three that I've enjoyed as well. Eve remains one of my favorite characters, and though I kinda hate seeing her go back to her parents, I do love how staunchly she's put her foot down and stood up for herself here, basically straight up telling them that if they don't respect who she is, she will not be a part of their lives.
I am tired of feeling like a freak and a failure every time I come home, and I don't deserve it.
I also love that Eve is going back to school and the way she's chosen to learn specifically to help hone her abilities. I mean, honestly, very cool decision to take an architecture course so that she can better understand how to craft things with her abilities in structurally sound ways, especially after the whole park collapse incident. Just a creative way for her to literally learn from her mistakes. I do think that maybe the whole Mark and Eve relationship aspect of the season is something that I feel is getting a little buried at least so far. There are some pretty nice moments. I particularly liked Eve being very understanding when Mark showed up late for their date, because surprise, when you're fully honest about who you are and your life and responsibilities, people are more understanding. The hero ex-hero ship is paying off. I also really liked the way she helped quell Mark's understandable fears about how much he's taking on and his fears about letting everybody down, helping him realize that all of the people counting on him are also there to support him. And of course, there's the big end of the episode mystery, the drones that seem to be controlled by another variant of Angstrom Levy, and with him specifically seeing what the Graysons are dealing with in regards to Oliver's attitude and abilities, I fully expect that this is how he's going to try and angle his way back in for revenge, possibly manipulating Oliver and using his abilities to his own advantage. Cannot wait to see how this plays out. Okay, maybe now's the right time to admit, it really sucks to see the animation kind of continue to get worse on this show. I know for a fact that they've been decreasing the budget the longer the show goes on, which feels insane to me given its success and popularity, and I feel like we are really starting to see some of those blemishes here in season 3. But sadly, I don't see this as something that will be addressed anytime soon, and might even just get worse as they slash staff and budgets further. My only other real critique so far is that I do feel like the show is moving very quickly. Granted, that's sort of just the nature of this show at this point with its 8-episode seasons, but I cannot help but wish the show was running like 10 to 12 episode seasons instead to let some of these storylines breathe a little. Like, the Oliver Oliver's storyline is very engaging and I am locked in, but for us to already be at the point where the kid is trying to be mini Omni-Man and murdering after only the 3-episode premiere feels like it's at a lightning pace. And other aspects of the story feel like they fall to the wayside a bit because of the shorter season orders, but overall, I'm so glad we have this show back. A massively successful adult animated series that isn't a comedy is a big deal. It just feels like maybe Amazon should be rewarding them with better budgets instead of limiting the potential of the product. But I'm stoked to see where the season continues to go. I really love the way it's fully enveloped in these themes of morality, particularly where Mark seems to be flying a bit off the deep end and is less in control than ever. And I'll definitely be covering the series week by week this year, so expect an episode 4 breakdown after that airs. And let me know below in the comments how you've been enjoying season 3 so far. Peace. And we're back with Invincible's 4th episode of the season, and honestly, this sort of felt more like 2 mini episodes sewn together. Not complaining though, because those mini episodes were pretty sick. One of them showing us an insane authoritarian future for Earth, while also forcing Mark to face his own ideals and possible future, and the other giving us the most Allan/Nolan action we've gotten in a while in a really fun prison break. So spoilers for the episode You Were My Hero ahead, and I also just want to ask nicely, please don't spoil future comic events in the comments. I personally am reading the correlating comics after each season releases, and many others are just experiencing it through the show. So please just be cool about it. All right, let's get going. One thing I didn't mention in my 3-episode premiere breakdown was this little budding romance between Rex and Ray, which I kind of love. They opened up to each other about their weird childhoods a bit in the old Teen Team base, and this episode opens on them grocery shopping together, a fun scene that highlights their differences pretty comedically. I'm eager to see where this goes because they're honestly a pretty fun couple, but the initial focus of the episode is Mark trying to figure out where the hell this drone came from, garnering no answers from Robot except that it's from Earth and that it's expensive. As you might expect, based on where their relationship is at, Mark blames Cecil and confronts him. Obviously, we know it isn't Cecil, but Mark just going berserk at the GDA HQ is a pretty strong indicator of where they're at in their professional relationship right now. And Cecil reveals something to Mark that we already knew.
If we wanted to spy on you, you'd never know it.
Obviously, we've seen that Cecil is fully monitoring Mark and his family, and it honestly seems like Mark should also know this already. But I get the sense that Mark is maybe hoping that this drone was Cecil spying on them, because the fact that it isn't means somebody else knows his identity and family secrets. But this is all sort of a quick follow-up to the events of the end of 303, and the episode fully shifts gears here, offering up some really fascinating lore and some deep ethical questions that challenge Mark's current worldview. Mark's date with Eve is immediately interrupted by those two homies that stole the Declaration of Independence in the first episode of the season. Turns out they're from the future, and they beg Mark to come help overthrow their tyrannical king. So in my last breakdown, a lot of people seemed to think I was being too harsh on Mark, or even outright saying he was wrong in most of his decision making, but that's not really what I was saying. While I don't agree with every decision Mark has made, I do fully understand how and why he's making them. I was really just pointing out the drama and conflict that is stemming from his trajectory as a character this season, how the traumatizing events of the first 2 seasons have really shifted his attitude, and how that attitude seems to be a far cry from the Mark we saw in the first 2 seasons. Obviously, characters change and evolve, but I think it's pretty clear that Mark is going through a bit of an angsty phase, where he's sort of overcorrected from his previous attitude. No, I wasn't saying that Multipole didn't deserve to go to jail. I was saying that the way in which Mark dealt with the conflict was far less empathetic than we're used to seeing from Mark. And I think that's a clear, intentional through line so far in this season. Previously, Mark would go far out of his way to help people who he felt needed them, like Titan in season 1. This year, Mark is a little harsher in his judgments of who deserves help, and this is a perfect example of this. Mark refuses to help these guys overthrow a full-on dictator.
You're lucky we're on a date, or I'd be taking you both to prison.
Seems like Mark really loves throwing people in prison this season, but he has so much on his shoulders this year, and it's clearly weighing on him heavily, which seems to be leading to his harsher, no-nonsense attitude. But even Eve could tell that this was an out-of-character decision for Mark based on her reaction here.
Are you sure about this?
Yeah, I'm not ruining our date just because...
And of course, once he's taken to the future and is given the full scope of the tyranny that's befallen Earth, Mark does help. At his core, Mark is still a good person who is trying to do the right thing. It's the weight of expectations on him, as well as the drama of his own personal life, that are causing him to act a little more super cop and a little less let's help people. But what I love about Mark's story in this episode is that the issue at hand is hitting him on multiple fronts. He's not only being forced to reconcile with aspects of his own future in multiple ways, but he's also being directly directly confronted with a dilemma that is challenging the good and bad ideology that he's been very strict about this season. And that all comes alongside the reveal of how this calamitous future came to be and who this tyrannical king actually is. The twins inform Mark that this ruler was put in charge when Earth was on the brink of collapse, and he was a good king for a while, but he eventually became this authoritarian dictator. This world has curfew 100% of the time, people can only go out to the work camps or to attend executions. Absolutely brutal stuff. Everything about this world and how the people in it are treated is abhorrent, which makes the reveal that this deranged ruler is none other than the Immortal that much more shocking to Mark. So like I said, there are so many angles from which this little side quest challenges Mark's worldview. For one, he has to actually reconcile with aspects of his own future. He learns that he himself was the one who put Immortal in charge of the planet before abandoning Earth himself with his family. There are also some hints towards some other issues Mark might be dealing with in the future.
Have you been sick again? I thought they found a cure for you.
This isn't about me.
But another thing that really hits Mark is the fact that in the time period that he just left, Immortal and Kate had just gotten engaged, and here in the future, Immortal can't even remember Kate.
I've outlived everyone I've ever loved. Do you know what that does to a man?
It really doesn't seem like Mark has thought too intently about the reality of his extended lifespan. Obviously, Nolan tried to really get this idea through his head in season 1, but I don't think Mark has reconciled with it in any meaningful way. It seems like this reaction is him being confronted with this fact head on for one of the first times.
No, but
I think this likely hits even harder because Mark literally came to the future from a date with Eve. And that's also just where he wants to be in this moment. A pretty heavy realization that at some point, he might not even remember Eve. But Immortal's dilemma here is even heavier. He reveals that the only reason he began reigning with an iron fist was because he couldn't take the mental strain of being in this role for centuries. And he was desperately trying to lure Mark back to Earth to relieve him of his duty and to kill him. This is the exact kind of moral dilemma to deeply challenge Mark at this point in his journey. Faced with the reality that in order to save the planet, he will have to kill a man he has respected for his entire life, something he absolutely does not want to do.
You will kill me, whether you want to or not.
Forcing Mark to make a personal choice that is contrary to his personal belief system for the betterment of the planet, oof. He's been preaching all season about how he doesn't kill, about how killing is the line he won't cross. He's lamented the time that he did cross it with Levy, albeit accidentally. It's a great personal dilemma for the character, and though he literally saved the planet by going through with it, he does not feel good about it.
don't thank me. Please don't thank me for that.
And I think beyond the surface here, Mark is maybe being forced to reevaluate some of those staunchly held values he has insisted upon throughout this season. Earlier in the season, he went off on Cecil for utilizing Sinclair and Darkwing despite the way they've hurt and killed people. But now he's looking at the same issue in reverse. Darkwing was a character who made horrible mistakes and has since begun saving more people in an attempt to make up for it, something Mark takes exception to in the first episode of the season. Immortal is a character who spent centuries helping and saving people, only to spiral out of control into this deranged dictator. Knowing all of the good that Immortal did and all the things he did to help the world made stopping him a deeply difficult thing for Mark to have to do, even though he did much worse things than Darkwing on a much more massive scale. It's so fascinating how such a similar dilemma presented a bit differently can make Mark so unsure of his ideals.
He hurt a lot of people. Yeah, I know. But he saved a lot of people too.
This is a great show. Even smaller aspects of this story sort of challenge some of Mark's perceptions. The only reason these dudes stole the Declaration of Independence in the first place was because of a rumor that the ink was the only thing that could kill their deranged ruler. Is it okay to steal if doing so will literally end a murderous dictatorship? This show is just so eager to dive into those quandaries, and it's one of the things I really love about it. And for Mark to be confronted with these things that challenge his ideas of what's right, alongside some of the scarier possibilities coming up in his own future, I think makes what he does next all the more impactful. He just talks with Eve, a person who helps him center himself to a place where he can be confident in who he is deep down. There's this great moment where Eve assures Mark that she'll get his ass in line if he ever strays down that tyrannical path on one condition.
If you promise to do the same for me.
You'd never do something like...
This little script flip was such a simple but effective way for Mark to realize that, of course, he would never intentionally become that person. It's important to believe in who you are. And while I do still think that the relationship is kinda not getting the time it deserves within the show and things are moving a little fast, I really enjoyed this little date montage after this. Even if it did feel like it needed to use an excessive amount of season 1 and 2 Mark/Eve moments to make us feel like this relationship has been built up properly, but despite my misgivings, I think it all works really well. It's a lovely sequence, and after another heavy and traumatic event, it allows Mark to live in the moment and get back to a place where he can feel like himself. And even though they literally call out that saying I love you is way too soon for them, it still basically worked for me. Pretty great sequence. Gotta say, I do think it's very funny the way they've transitioned over to Allan stories 2 separate times now by having Paul F. Tompkins pipe in with some narration right before Mark pipes down. Weird, but funny. And we always love a Paul F. Tompkins cameo. What is this, a crossover episode, etc. But the half of the episode that focuses on Allan and Nolan is pretty damn great and gave me one of my favorite Nolan moments in the entire series. We've seen a little bit of Allan and Nolan across the season so far, mostly indicating that, though he could escape, Allan refuses to leave without Nolan, also revealing that he's much stronger than the Viltrumites expected. But here in this little half episode, Allan gets his chance as Nolan is finally taken in for his execution.
Goodbye, my friend.
Finally.
This entire part of the episode is mostly just solid action. Allan taking out guards, trying to get to Nolan, even recruiting Battle Beast in a pretty comical sequence. I do appreciate that Battle Beast doesn't really care about the escape, he just wants a good challenge, a good fight. He wants to fight some Viltrumites. But outside of the great action and fun prison break, the real meat and potatoes of this story is all Nolan focused. Obviously, since the events of the season 1 finale, Nolan has been changing. We saw it on Thraxa with his new family and his genuine desire to protect the planet from the Viltrumites, and we've seen him slowly start to reconcile with how he's changed while in prison. He was so indoctrinated with Viltrumite supremacy rhetoric, and as he started to feel more empathy for other people and regret for the crimes he's committed, he's starting to understand that he does feel genuine love for people. For Mark, Oliver, Debbie, and Andressa, I always loved the shock in his own voice when he admitted this.
I think I miss my wife.
To me, the absolute highlight of this entire prison break is the interactions between the 2 Viltrumite executioners and Nolan. Nolan has accepted his fate, believing that he deserves to die, not for betraying Viltrum, but for the horrendous damage he's caused and allowed on Earth and on Thraxa. But the executioners ask him if his betrayal was worth it, and he affirms that it absolutely was.
And I'm sad you'll never understand.
We also get this great moment where it looks like Allan is about to be killed and Nolan summons the strength to protect him, once again showcasing how Nolan has changed, feeling genuine empathy for other people. It again seems like it shocks even himself.
No Viltrumite would do such a thing for another. I mean, you would.
This is the highlight on the personal development side, at least, because there's also a huge piece of lore revealed that truly changes everything. Nolan reveals that the Viltrumite reinforcements will not be coming after them despite the prison break.
There are fewer than 50 pure-blooded Viltrumites left in the universe.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Obviously, one of the biggest, most important revelations in the entire series, and maybe the first twinge of hope anyone has managed to feel that Earth isn't completely doomed. While upwards of 50 Viltrumites does still sound like a terrifying threat, it's a far cry from what we would have expected from a galactic empire. I personally love the development because while it does bring a little bit of hope, it doesn't in any way make it feel like Earth is safe now, because we've seen what even a single Viltrumite can do. But now, suddenly, there are a few people that can actually go toe-to-toe with Viltrumites that seemingly intend on protecting Earth. Mark, Nolan, Allan, maybe even Oliver, not to mention the collective superhero community on Earth that, while not as strong as Viltrumites, may have the benefit of numbers. But what I love most about this development is that through Nolan, it's going to challenge Mark in the exact same ways we've been seeing so far this season. It's a really huge revelation to go alongside his immortal dilemma from earlier in this episode. Nolan has done absolutely unforgivable things. Full stop. Worse than any of the people that Mark already has taken issue with in terms of their GDA involvement. But Mark is going to have to accept Nolan's help in protecting Earth if they want to stand any chance. Not to mention that Earth itself will likely have to accept Nolan's help if they want to survive, despite the chaos and carnage he wrought. I'm pretty eager to see how these interpersonal politics play out, how Nolan will attempt to help, whether that's initially from afar, if he'll return to Earth and actually reveal himself. Maybe he'll do it in disguise with some kind of new alter ego. It also begs the question, how and why has the Viltrum Empire dwindled so significantly? Does it have to do with the fact that they sent so many Viltrumites out to the far reaches of the galaxy that they ignored repopulation back home? Have their strict eugenics policies actually prevented them from being able to repopulate? I mean, I guess it's also possible they've just straight up killed each other. Is there a secret weakness that we don't know about? Or does it have something to do with what Immortal was hinting at earlier in the episode?
Have you been sick again? I thought they found a cure for you.
This isn't about me.
Definitely possible that there's some kind of Viltrumite-specific illness that's been thinning their numbers over centuries. Very eager to see what we learn and how Nolan and Allan approach reconnecting with Mark and Earth. I will say, I think that this is another episode where you can slightly feel those budgets tightening. Not because of the animation quality, but because of the sheer volume of reused clips. The entire Mark/Eve date montage was riddled with clips from season 1 and 2, and then when the Allan the Alien episode started, we genuinely got about 5 to 6 minutes of full-on recap before much new stuff started happening. Don't get me wrong, I think the recap was helpful and I liked seeing it all laid out in context, but 5 to 6 minutes is kind of a crazy amount of time to be mostly reusing old footage. But it was effective at the very least. This season is progressing in a way that I'm very locked in for. We're now halfway through season 3 with 4 more episodes en route, and I definitely intend on continuing to talk about the show week by week. The moral dilemmas and character drama showcased in this show, it's some of my favorite out there. And make sure to check out my breakdown from the premiere 3 episodes, as well as my video I did last year about Mark and Nolan's inverted character trajectories. Also, I want to hear what you think about season 3 of Invincible so far. Are you digging it? What stories are you latching onto? Let me know in the comments, and I'll catch you next time. Peace. Alright, we're back again with Invincible's 5th episode of its 3rd season, in a story that really checks in on and expands its side characters and stories. We get a remarkable deep dive into Duplicate and Multipol's history, a massive development in the Titan/Machine Head story, maybe the most important Mark and Eve story so far, and a lot more. While I've seen some people complain that this feels like filler, I'd like to belligerently disagree. The world building is one of the show's greatest strengths, and so many of these side stories are vitally important to reinforcing the overall themes of the season. This week's episode was exactly what I thought this season needed to help pace out the narrative and settle our characters before stuff gets real. Spoilers for the episode, this was supposed to be easy ahead, and I just want to once again kindly ask y'all, please do not spoil the comics for anybody in the comments. Thank you. So this episode features a handful of interconnected stories spanning across a bunch of characters. We've got a huge focus on Titan, his family, and his conflict with Master Liu and the Order now that he's running the city. This intertwines with the craziest Multipol story we've gotten, which also adds a ton of detail and nuance to his and Kate's history, and of course Mark and Eve learning to monetize their abilities to make ends meet now that they're working on their own without Cecil. It's all really great, important progression and truly features some of the most insane sequences in the entire series, which is why we should start with Multipol. The prison break sequence truly broke my brain. Absolutely unhinged concept, and I'm not even sure how much of it I can show because it is violent. Paul basically wedges one of himself safely in the ceiling area and then multiplies until his dying duplicates crush each other and fill the space so tightly that the door flies off the hinge. Literal sicko mode. One of the grossest things I've ever seen in this show, and honestly, kind of cool. So cool that it had me rooting for this escape attempt just on a narrative level. And this escape attempt leads to what is for sure one of the highlights of the episode for me, a deep dive into Kate and Paul's lives leading up to their diverting paths as hero and villain. The flashback to their childhood, revealing that their father basically went catatonic, having to try and take care of the countless duplicates of both children, was very sad, and showcases something that we've seen explored through Rex and Ray's dialogue a bit in this season too, how kids with powers are almost certainly going to be used by somebody to further their own goals and motives. Ray's parents used her, Rex was sold to the state, and similarly, Kate and Paul were trained by some kind of government agency to be used as assets, starting when they were children. I hope this show is willing to explore these concepts even further because I think it's the type of exploitation that has a lot of potential to be unpacked really thoroughly within this universe. And I think this little flashback does a cool job showing the results it can yield, and maybe more interestingly, how those diverting paths that Kate and Paul took can be pretty damn parallel parallel. Paul ends up abandoning the training and going on the run, eventually falling into the life of crime, being used as an assassin by the Order, while Kate continues through the program and then is utilized on Teen Team and the Guardians by the GDA. But ultimately, I think what this little vignette is trying to break down is that for people with powers like this, these paths aren't all that different, at least on a personal level. Both Kate and Paul are being used by organizations to further their own goals. Neither of them have much of a say in terms of who or what they get to do or be in the world. They're superpowered, indentured servants for bigger, more powerful people. And I think most fittingly, the first thing we hear Kate say to Paul really illustrates this.
I was this close to convincing Cecil to put you on a team to make up for all the shit you've done.
Paul's ticket out of trouble is basically just to become a pawn for a different group, a different master. And he rightfully doesn't really see this as any different than what he was doing before. And as this season has shown time and time again, people with these kinds of abilities are not often left in isolation.
Just like your GDA. They don't abandon tools they're not done with yet.
I think what makes this story so tragic is that you can't blame Paul for leaving as a kid, for escaping what was basically a forced superpowered boot camp so he could become a tool and a pawn. There's obviously no defending the actions he's taken as an adult and the things he's done for the Order, but there is a sincere tragedy in the fact that he was a kid who was taken advantage of. He felt trapped, and his escape into a more welcoming environment led him into a horrendous life of crime and murder. And I also think it's an interesting show of character for Kate that, despite what Paul has done, she was willing to try and get him out of prison to be part of one of Cecil's teams, once again tying into the themes of characters' malleable morality this season. But the attempted Paul breakouts also tie into the Titan story in this episode, which is a welcome check-in for me. Titan took over Machine Head's organized crime ring in the city, but now he's reconciling with the fact that his crime ring is also supposed to answer to a bigger organization, the Order, which of course happens to be run by a man who can turn into a dragon. I love this universe. But Master Liu, aka the Dragon Man, is basically testing Titan's loyalty, seeing if he'll break Paul out of prison for him and threatening his family in the process. And I think this is a super interesting conundrum for Titan. He manipulated Mark and usurped Machine Head all so that he wouldn't have to answer to anybody anymore. He became the top dog, only to realize that there isn't really such thing. Even seemingly at the top, he has someone above him to answer to still. And rather than bend knee to the Order, he once again manages to game the system, but we'll get there. It's another example of how well this show navigates the complexities of this superpowered world, intermingled with aspects of real life. This season as a whole is showing how difficult it can be for anyone in this world to exist outside of some sort of system. Whether that's the Guardians, who quit earlier in the season, Mark refusing to work with the GDA, or Titan desperately trying to remain beholden to no masters. Speaking of Mark refusing to work with the GDA, the Mark x Eve subplot is probably the most important so far in terms of their relationship, and honestly it's the thing that I felt this season was really missing the mark on until now, pun intended. It's kinda easy to forget that Mark and Eve are still pretty young, and the whole navigating an adult relationship while living at home thing plays a big role here, down to Eve sneaking out of Mark's room and pretending to be in the neighborhood for breakfast.
They made too much noise playing and woke me up.
And the difficulties of this lead to Mark and Eve once again making some very big, very fast decisions within their relationship, like trying to get their own apartment.
If we had a place of our own, we could just be together.
Honestly, I do find this scene very cute and they're very charming together. I love them as a couple. It just still all feels way too fast. I've been saying this all season. This is no different for me. But the other major development here is Invincible Inc., Eve's business plan so that the pair can actually make a living outside of the existing superhero systems. A really fun idea, basically putting Mark and Eve on retainer at Peyton Penitentiary in case of superpowered breakouts or break-ins, which obviously fits giving the multi-Paul breakout subplot this episode. Really, all of this episode's various subplots fit together really neatly. I also love seeing Eve take charge on the business side of things. She's gone on such a journey over the course of the show and has shown the most interest in finding ways outside of straight up superheroism to use her powers. I like that she's got her focus in different areas and learning to navigate the world outside of some of these existing organizations. Mark and Eve's desires to move into their own place also exacerbates Oliver's acting out a tiny bit, but I really loved this little Oliver focused sequence. After he runs away from home, Mark and Eve discover that he's actually made friends, like real normal friends. And I have to say, I was wildly relieved when they fully baited us into thinking he was going to pummel these bullies, only for him to simply simply pants them. I think this is not only a great piece of development for Oliver, but for Mark as well. It really highlights how much watching over Oliver is weighing on Mark's shoulders and how difficult it's been for him to sit idly by and hope/trust that Oliver will learn to do the right thing. It's sort of a crash course in parenting as basically the surrogate father figure in Oliver's life.
He's a good kid, Mark.
This is further exacerbated by the fact that Debbie is really counting on Mark to help, since having a purple, super-powered alien child isn't exactly precedented. Debbie really struggles with the idea of how she might be able to handle parenting Oliver on her own.
I can't follow him like you can, Mark.
This also adds to that ever-building pressure that Mark is feeling. There is just an overwhelming number of things coming at him from all angles. The impending Viltrumite invasion, being at odds with Cecil, the mysterious drones spying on him and his family, general superheroing duties and making ends meet, and then balancing that with his love life and family life. Of course, he's incredibly worried about his brother and mom, who were nearly killed the previous season. It's easy to understand why he's starting to crack a little bit, why he's becoming a little more hardened and angsty in this era. This episode goes a long way to highlight that sort of Peter Parker problem, the work-life balance issue. Mark and Eve spend the entire episode figuring out how they can start their life together and do what's best for them, and by the end, they realize that they don't really have that luxury yet. And we'll get back to that. All of these stories culminate in a big, messy, organized crime dragon attack. Does that track at all? I actually really love how this all plays out. Titan basically 4D chesses himself to freedom by working with Machine Head again and playing Liu and the Order. He allows Liu to believe he was in control, assaulting Peyton Penitentiary to break Paul out, but during the chaos, Isotope breaks Machine Head out of the very same prison. But before we get into those results, let's talk about the dragon fight. Another reason I'm kinda shocked by anyone who says this episode was boring filler, this shit is fun, and seeing Mark and Eve team up in such an effective and satisfying way is a really great reflection of how in sync they are in terms of their relationship. They've just been really successful in terms of being there for and supporting one another, and that's showcased in both their personal lives and in the way they fight. Not to mention Eve's sick pink energy armor. Though once again, Mark really does kind of get his ass kicked here. Even though he does manage to kill Liu one time, dude just regenerates, and Mark is basically fully impaled. I don't know how he made it out of this one. But what makes these intertwining stories work for me is the Machine Head reveal. Once he breaks out of prison, he full-on murders Liu when he's in his dragon trance, stopping the assault on the prison and leaving a very vacant position at the top of the Order. And because this was all facilitated by Titan, he gets what he wants as well. Even though he previously was responsible for usurping Machine Head, by helping him take this even higher position of authority, Titan gets exactly what he wants. He gets to keep his position, and he gets out of the Order. With one caveat though.
Backstab me again, and I'm gonna drown you in your kid's blood.
Though I do have to say, the post-credit scene being another character who has just died, immediately being resurrected, did kind of annoy the hell out of me. But yeah, Liu will be back for blood. Again, I really think this episode is just well written. It's a lot of seemingly disparate stories seamlessly woven together into a really cool fight and showdown with a lot of fun twists. But on a character level, they do one thing that went a really long way for me. Remember how I have not shut up about how, despite their chemistry, Mark and Eve have been moving way too quickly as a couple?
I have been feeling like things were moving kind of fast.
Thank you, Eve. Eve and Mark both decide that moving in together isn't really feasible with everything that's going on, and they acknowledge that they will probably benefit from not rushing too quickly into anything right now. I really love Eve and Mark together, so this was something I really needed. A proper in-universe acknowledgement of what I felt was more of a pacing issue in an episode that, in my opinion, really helps even out that pacing. This episode was so vitally important for its characters and maneuvering various pieces within the world building, and though I know some people felt like it was quote-unquote filler, obviously these events are going to play roles later in the show. Liu's betrayal and resurrection, Multi-Paul's breakout, Machine Head's claiming of the Order, Titan's precarious position as a mob boss while trying to protect his family, so many new pieces on the board, and now, after a couple of slower, more paced out episodes, the season is likely going to barrel full speed ahead towards what will undoubtedly be an explosive final stretch of the season. I've actually seen up through episode 6 already, and let me tell you, next week's episode, whew, I cannot wait to talk about that thing. But what do y'all think about this week's Invincible? Do you appreciate the world building and vital character development as much as I do, or do you just want to see the big boys punch each other? Let me know below in the comments. Stay tuned because next week, it's a wild one. Peace. Well, that was devastating. This week's Invincible, titled All I Can Say Is I'm Sorry, is not just my favorite of the season so far, it is easily one of my favorites in the show's history. It's a prime example of the ways this show is willing to explore the trickle effect of a superhero-powered world, and ways our heroes' actions, even when righteous, can have lasting, devastating effects on the world and its citizens. It's about how when the world leaves its citizens behind, they desperately seek out somewhere to put the blame, some explanation as to why things are happening to them. It asks whether or not heroes, even ones that are trying to help the world, should be made to answer to that world for the decisions they make. In fact, I think this episode basically succeeds where another massive big-budget blockbuster superhero movie failed at exploring very similar themes, and I can't wait to dive into it more. Spoilers for the episode All I Can Say Is I'm Sorry ahead, and I just want to once again kindly ask y'all not to spoil the comics for anybody in the comments. Thanks. Okay, obviously there's a lot in this episode, but yes, the focus of this video is Scott Duvall, aka Powerplex, played by guest star Aaron Paul, who is excellent.
Hooray!
The episode opens with a flashback scene set during the events of episode 108, the season 1 finale. It shows Scott spending an afternoon with his sister and niece in Chicago before revealing that it takes place during the big Invincible/Omni-Man disaster. I highly recommend going back and rewatching these moments from 108 as well, because it adds a whole additional devastating layer to the circumstance as you see Jessica and Gretchen's final moments and how hard Mark fought to save them. But all Scott sees is Invincible and Omni-Man fighting, causing unimaginable destruction, leading to the horrifying death of his sister and niece. Okay, I'm just gonna get into this now. This entire episode is doing Zack Snyder's Batman v Superman, but, well, better. Both open showcasing prior events in the timeline from a new perspective. BVS shows the climax of Man of Steel, Invincible shows the events in Chicago. And both try to show that, from another perspective, it's harder to see Invincible or Superman as a hero, and pretty easy to see them as the source of death and devastation. And both of these narratives deal with not only the people who suffered most in these devastating events, but how the world has left those people behind, and how they feel that the heroes in question should have some level of culpability. Compounded by the fact that these heroes are put on pedestals and heralded as saviors without even an investigation into their thought processes or decision making during those events. Obviously, we as an audience saw in 108 that the circumstances were near impossible to avoid, that Mark was doing what he thought he needed to do to save the most people. We literally saw that Mark tried desperately to save Jessica and Gretchen specifically, and that he was absolutely gutted with despair when he failed. But we're looking at things from the perspective of a viewer who gets full context. The world does not get this context, and though some people choose to believe that Mark did everything he could and was just trying to do the right thing, it's hard to accept this for the people who have suffered and lost so much, especially when nobody seems to care about their loss. Scott initially tries to incite an investigation into the Chicago event simply so that they can know more about what happened, if Invincible was culpable in any way, but they refuse to even consider it because, as the world sees it, Invincible is a hero who did the right thing.
Look, it feels like their deaths don't matter.
I have never been a huge fan of Snyder's BVS, but I will say the one thing I do respect most about it is its inclination to explore this question in regards to Superman. This one man has so much power, and though we know Superman is trying to do the right thing, should that person be made to answer to the people he is trying to help? Does he owe them explanations on his thought processes and decision making when he is trying to save the world? Should people just trust that he is doing the right thing with that power, even when the outcome completely upends their lives? Of course, BVS mostly uses this as a jumping off point into the muddier Batman vs Superman story, but I do think it has some pretty interesting takes in regards to these questions. I think where BVS fails is in its characterization of Superman. If we had maybe seen Superman's more personal connection to the people he saved over the course of these movies and how much he actually does care about humanity, this question would have been one that created more dramatic conflict. But I think those movies really fail to show Superman's humanity in a way that's true to the character, which is exactly where this episode of Invincible succeeds, because we know firsthand, particularly through the dialogue during his fight with Nolan, that Mark truly and genuinely cares about humanity, that Earth is his home and he will do anything he can to protect it and its people. We know because we saw Mark try to save Jessica and Gretchen desperately, and we saw that it destroyed him when he failed. We know these things weigh on him. So this episode does this amazing job showcasing both of these realities that coexist. The one where we know that Mark did everything he could could, and where we also know that from Scott's perspective, he couldn't possibly know that Mark did everything he could. It will always be this horrifying question that nobody is willing to entertain. He just has to sit and accept the notion that a hero tried but failed, and people will still put him on a pedestal for that failure.
Heroes like him leave thousands dead in their wake.
And eventually, that this nagging pain from being left behind and ignored will lead him down a revenge-driven path that turns him into the exact thing he was fighting against. But we will get there, because the other thing I love so much about this episode is that all of its smaller subplots thematically tie into these questions in regards to heroes and citizens' places in this society. Scott in this episode is basically forced to reconcile with the idea that heroes don't have to answer to society in the same ways that citizens do. And obviously this episode is largely about perspective and how from his point of view, they're afforded free reign. This is further explored through a couple smaller sequences. One when Debbie's new boo Paul is trying to relate to the kids at dinner. Mark, Eve, and Oliver are all heroes, and Paul sort of haphazardly tries to compare what they do to his experience in real estate, which Oliver outright laughs at, but I think Paul's sort of embarrassment goes a long way to highlight this societal divide. Paul is ashamed he even considered comparing his experience to theirs, and they in turn laughed at the notion. But I think what Debbie says here is one of the most important quotes in the episode.
Just because we aren't saving the world doesn't mean our jobs aren't important.
This is kind of what the entire episode is about. There's this feeling that superheroes are more important because of what they're capable of and the work they can do to save people. But it's a double-edged sword where it can make people like Scott feel unimportant, like the lives they failed to save don't matter. There's a reason that saving lives matters though. It's because all of these lives are important. Though this Paul sequence is small and kind of funny, it really lends to the thematic resonance of the episode. How can these classifications of people coexist in society and have different rules and different perceptions without things getting messy? Obviously, with the Powerplex of it all, the answer is they sort of can't. This idea also lends to the excellent Rex and Ray scenes in this episode where Ray decides she's going to quit being a hero, and this shows the flip side of the expectations that come with being a hero. Though it appears to the outside world that the heroes have free reign and don't have to answer to anyone, the reality is they have their own set of rules that can often be pretty messed up. Rex and Ray were both forced into heroism as kids, in different circumstances, and have existed in this world largely against their will. They don't get to have a normal life, and I love how this episode showcases that some heroes want a normal life.
Are you happy almost dying over and over again so other people can live the lives we never get?
In regards to Rex, he's somebody who has never really had his own identity outside of this superhero persona. So not only is he somebody who doesn't have a regular life to go back to, he wouldn't even know how to have a regular life. The last sequence that I think really lends to these themes of the episode focus on Oliver and perspective. Oliver struggles with the idea that his father is not only a bad person, but that the entire world sees him as this bad person, particularly when he only has these amazing memories of him, and that he believes if his mother loved Nolan, that he must have been good. He struggles to understand that Nolan could have done heroic things and unspeakably evil things.
They don't know about Thraxa, or the Viltrum Empire, or anything that happened since Dad left.
Oliver's desire for Nolan's good qualities to be seen alongside his bad qualities is really difficult for him to reconcile with, that there are these two sides to Nolan, and that the things he did to Earth could never really fully be made up for in the eyes of Earth's citizens, no matter how righteous. And I think this ties to the Powerplex dilemma on a larger scale. It's all about that perspective, where Powerplex sees the damage that was directly caused by Invincible's actions, and no matter what people say Mark has done to save others, it doesn't make up for it to him. Okay, let's dive back into that Powerplex storyline, because while I do love the way this episode helps you empathize with Scott and people who have suffered like him in this superpowered world, they also take this revenge storyline to its most devastating conclusion. Because the world leaves him behind and he sees no other options, Scott tries to take matters into his own hands. He gets a job at the GDA and starts investigating the events himself. He starts stealing tech that helps charge up his limited electricity abilities so that he can actually find justice for himself. His wife is even there to support him every step of the way, down to listening to and advising on his monologue for Invincible when he finally faces him. Of course, the other major aspect of this episode is that Mark basically dodges every opportunity to face Powerplex that arises, leading to more frustration from Scott, making him feel even more insignificant. During their first possible encounter, Scott jumps off a building to charge up and starts calling out for Invincible while on the news. During this, Mark is at William's birthday at the bowling alley, which is overall another great scene. I really loved seeing Mark and Amber reunite for the first time in in their new lives and how much better they're both doing in their new relationships. It was charming to see. I really appreciate that they both still have so much love for each other despite things not working out between them and them knowing that things are better off now. But what really stuck out during this scene was that when Mark turns off the news before he can hear Powerplex call out for Invincible, basically everyone who knows that Mark is invincible was a little confounded by his behavior.
What? I can take a night off. You know there's other heroes out there, right?
I think particularly with Amber and Eve reacting so confusedly, especially with Amber not having seen Mark in quite a while and really seeing the contrast between how he was in previous seasons and how he is now. Just another example of how Mark's attitude has really shifted this season. But Powerplex's experience fighting Shapesmith instead of Invincible is so vital to the slippery slope he slides down over this story. Obviously, Powerplex wants to face Invincible. He didn't intend to fight anybody else. And so when Shapesmith shows up, he mostly tries to ignore him, to brush him off, until Shapesmith just starts pummeling the shit out of him. That pummeling obviously charges up Scott's electrical abilities, and ultimately, he fully zaps the hell out of Shapesmith to the point where the bystanders think that Shapesmith might be dead. This could have been such a turning point for Scott if he hadn't been so driven by revenge, because he was basically on the other end of exactly what he experienced with Invincible. He knows that he wasn't trying to hurt Shapesmith. He was in full defense mode, but to the bystanders, it looked like Scott fully attacked and nearly killed him.
He attacked me! You saw what happened!
Oh man, you saw what happened hits so hard here, because yeah, they did see what happened, but their perception of exactly what went down didn't have the full context. They only saw what they saw. And so now, Scott is being judged by these bystanders in a wildly negative way, the same exact way he judged Invincible. And I'm not saying he doesn't have the right to question the events of Chicago. It's a near impossible scenario to even comprehend. Of course you would want answers, but if Scott had not been quite so far down that revenge-driven path, maybe this could have been the wake-up call he needed to understand how tough it is to fully grasp the context of these kinds of complicated superpowered scenarios. Only Scott knew his intentions, and everyone else judged his intentions based on what they saw. Does that sound familiar, Scott? We haven't even really touched on Scott's family and how his and his wife's revenge-driven obsession is basically leading to them neglecting their toddler. This man is doing everything in pursuit of justice without realizing how his actions are actually causing more harm to those around him. And his wife is the one who tells him he'll get another shot at Invincible at the memorial service for the victims of the events in Chicago, where he interrupts the speeches and once again tries to lure out Mark. But this time, Eve and Debbie convince Mark to stay back while Eve deals with it. Eventually, the Guardians show up, and once again, Scott feels fully ignored by Invincible. With the rage he's already feeling, to have two separate public incidents like this both go awry, man, this dude has just gotta be seething at this point. You go fully ignored when you voice your concerns, and then when you take matters into your own hands, you still get ignored? Not a surprise that he busts out of the prison truck and tries one more time. I love how this event affects Mark, though. Though he didn't face Powerplex, the incident basically shifts his perspective and forces him to really face the reality of what happened in Chicago. We know the events weighed on him, but even earlier in the episode, he considered not going to the memorial. He said he thought it might be disrespectful, but I think it's obvious it was because he was afraid to reconcile with the destruction he was a part of. Now, after he heard the cries of somebody who was affected by that destruction, he considers his part in it.
But shouldn't I be seeing stuff like this? Shouldn't we really understand the consequences of what we do?
One thing that really sticks out to me this entire episode is Scott's emotional state. It's clear that he only sees his actions as a last resort, sort of a desperation move. He's not getting anything positive out of it. During the scene earlier when he's practicing his monologue for Invincible, he just immediately starts sobbing afterwards. And this emotional state is sold so well by Aaron Paul, who just does an incredible job with his performance. And obviously the big climax is where it's best showcased. After escaping the prison truck, he and his wife decide that pretending that she and their son have been kidnapped by him and held hostage is the only way to lure out Invincible. This scene in the ruins of the very building where Invincible failed to save Jessica and Gretchen is so good. It showcases Mark's genuine remorse as he desperately tries to apologize for his failures.
I can't imagine what you went through. or the pain you're feeling.
But most importantly, Scott expresses that issue at the core of this episode. He needs to know why Invincible gets the privilege of being superpowered, why he sits in a different class when so many others die in these superpowered events.
What makes you so special?
I think this is a question that sort of extends into our real world. At its core, it's just, why do some people have more privilege? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why isn't life fair? Obviously, this is true in the real world as well, but particularly in this world with heroes and villains, many of these things have such explosive, violent consequences. Maybe most chillingly, Scott expresses his biggest issue with Invincible right before his revenge drives him to become that very thing.
You're the one who kills innocent people.
I can't say enough about this electric climax, as Scott finally gets the best of Mark and fills his attack with all of that seething rage and resentment he's been feeling, doing what he felt was the right and justified thing to help people, only for those powers to extend beyond his control, killing his own wife and child. Holy shit. We know Scott wasn't doing the right thing here, but for him to be so committed in his belief that he was getting justice for people who have been wronged, only to enact the same kind of collateral damage that led him to believe this about Invincible in the first place, it's just so brutal. I love this scene at the prison after this in particular, where Mark tries desperately to convey his regret to Scott, to convey how he's still growing and how this is going to help him be a better hero. And I just love how Scott's reaction highlights how tone deaf this was for Mark to say. This man lost his entire family through these events, and Mark is standing there telling him to feel comfort for the ways it helped him, the person that Scott blames for all of this. Read the room, dude. I love Mark. I know he tries his best, but I think one of the things that makes this show so great is the fact that Mark is still growing and learning. He's super young still, but his actions have massive consequences, so his growing pains hurt more people than just himself. The way we all reconcile with the mistakes we've made in our lives, Mark has to reconcile with 10 times bigger mistakes because of the nature of his place in the society. That's one of the biggest through lines we've seen through these 3 seasons. I mentioned that BVS sort of uses the whole who does Superman answer to concept as a jumping off point, and I do really wish that it reconciled with it more in its resolution, but obviously it turns into something a lot bigger and more comic booky by the end of that movie. But I think Invincible takes the idea to its most devastating conclusion, and it actually ties to this season's themes really effectively. In the beginning of the season, Mark is very self-righteous about his heroism, about who should and shouldn't be allowed to be a hero, whose pasts should exclude them from being able to help moving forward. And then slowly his confidence in these ideals are weathered down over the season, through Oliver asking questions about their dad and if the good he did matters when he's also done bad, through his experience in the future being forced to kill the tyrannical future version of Immortal despite him knowing Immortal as somebody who saved so many people, and now through reconciling with the fact that though he believed he was doing the right thing throughout the events in Chicago, his actions did still have consequences. Every single minute detail in the decisions he made during these kinds of life and death situations affect so many people, affect so many paths. If he had managed to save Jessica and Gretchen, Scott wouldn't have fallen down this revenge-driven path and become the very thing he sought justice against. Okay, let's see if there are any odds and ends to talk about that I didn't fit into this video so far. I know a lot of people loved the Invincible title drop in this episode, but man, it kind of annoyed the hell out of me. Dropping the title card every time Powerplex yells his name over and over again. I think it's funny as like a meme, but in an episode this heavy, I wasn't a huge fan. That's just me though. I adore how Rex and Ray's relationship has developed, not a pairing I'd ever considered, and they really just work together. It's super cute. Rudy actually figuring out a way to stop Amanda's de-aging problem with her abilities, that's such a great scene. Even though it's filled with the funniest mishmash of science x magic mumbo jumbo, but seeing Amanda so grateful for what Rudy did for her, it's a really lovely sequence. And then of course we've got to talk about the post-credit scene. Here it comes, y'all. The full reveal that the drones do in fact belong to Angstrom Levy, and that he seemingly has his own personal army of Invincibles, prepping to take revenge on our Mark for the events of the season 2 finale. Honestly, one of my biggest issues with season 2 was that the Angstrom Levy stuff felt so minimal in the scheme of the story, and so to find out this was really just a part 1 of a bigger story, it feels right, even though I constantly complain about characters dying and coming back to life in this show. This time it works for me. And I imagine with all those Invincibles that this is the upcoming Invincible War people keep bringing up in my comment section. I think there's little doubt that we're about to see an absolutely insane end to season 3 in these final 2 episodes. But what do you think about episode 6, Powerplex, and the upcoming Angstrom Invincible stuff? Are you enjoying season 3? Let me know below in the comments, and I'll catch you next week. Peace. Whew, now that was an episode of Invincible. Dear Lord. After a couple of slower paced episodes, which I felt the season desperately needed personally, the show is barreling forward at a breakneck pace into some of the most brutal and affecting stories the show has to offer. This one obviously portraying the Invincible War, something that the fans of the comics have been so excited about they have not been able to help but comment about it. And honestly, it did live up. This episode is absolutely bonkers, portraying some of the darkest and most brutal scenes in the show and challenging Mark in a way that I don't think he could have even comprehended before this. Spoilers for the episode What Have I Done ahead, and just want to once again kindly ask y'all not to spoil the comics for anybody in the comments. Thanks. Man, I do love the way this episode not only just accelerates the events of the season full speed ahead, but uses this massive crisis to challenge everything Mark has been struggling with this season. And fittingly, it starts with a flashback to the end of last season, revealing exactly what happened to Angstrom and how he's returned after Mark seemingly killed him. And it is a brutal sequence. They really get up close and personal with the carnage. It's gross. Not sure how much I can actually even show here. Probably have to blur a lot of it. I'm not sure I love the initial concept of how Angstrom survived. It is hard to believe that this is a living thing right here, but I guess it does also showcase his resilience, his strength, and of course sets up the technicians as he crawls into the portal and they put him back together. But as I mentioned in my last video, I do love the idea that Angstrom survived and that he'll be an ongoing foil for Mark. As much as I loved season 2, Angstrom was set up early and felt largely removed from most of the events of that season, at least until the finale, and it all felt very rushed and quick. It seemed like they were setting up a bigger ongoing baddie, and then at the end of season 2, I was kind of like, oh, that's it for Angstrom? He's dead? So for me, his return here is welcome, and I love that he's going to have this ongoing feud with Mark and that it's getting increasingly personal. And his plan is also pretty diabolical. We had seen alternate Marks back in season 2 and got a taste of how evil they can be, but Angstrom's plan to use these evil Invincibles to not only absolutely decimate our Mark's Earth, but make the planet's citizens associate the biggest mass disaster event in human history with Invincible, bro, that is a lot. That is one way to get back at a dude. And we immediately see these alternate Invincibles enter this dimension and start messing shit up. Also alongside the Angstrom drones, with Angstrom making his plan clear. Make them fear Invincible, make them hate Invincible. The sequence of events for Mark is even more insane because he's still grappling with the incredibly traumatic events of last week's episode. He's barely removed from it, having witnessed Powerplex microwave his wife and child and blaming himself for those events. He's reconciling with the ways his actions have consequences and still determining how he approaches his heroism with that in mind. But he doesn't even get a chance before probably the most insane imaginable disaster starts to occur, and he has to just get out there and get back into action. A couple dozen alternate versions of himself just straight up murdering and destroying every major city on Earth. I gather from the way people talk about it that the Invincible War spanned quite a handful of issues, and I'm curious if people will be upset that it's relegated to a single episode of the show, but I gotta say, I think the execution was really well done, dividing it out into the days in which the attack was ongoing, with things feeling increasingly dire the longer it continues. There's such a great escalation to how anxiety-inducing this event is across the episode. Honestly, I love this episode in general, but the thing I most want to hype up is Steven Yeun's absolutely top-tier voice acting. I've always been a huge fan of his as a performer, and even specifically as a voice actor. He's Speckle in Tuca and Birdie, which is one of my favorite comedic voice acting performances maybe ever.
Birdie, my sister, she's marrying a criminal? He's an animal, but does crime?
But the various flavors he puts on his performances as alternate Mark/Invincibles are really so great. They really feel differentiated, and he gets to show off his range even as different versions of the same characters. I would love to do like a full-on showcase highlight reel here of these performances, but these Invincible breakdowns have actually been getting hit with these bogus copyright claims on the background music of scenes of all things, and it's not really worth risking, unfortunately. YouTube really needs to get a handle on their copyright claim system and prevent this kind of fraud, so I'm really sorry. But it feels like each and every variation of Invincible has a unique personality in this. We even see them clashing with one another at various points, despite working with the same goal in mind. There are some other really terrifying alt-Invincible moments throughout, too. It was awesome to see Oliver out there trying to actually help people, a far cry from the "some lives don't matter" attitude he displayed earlier in the season. But man, when he catches up to who he thinks is his Mark, only to find it's one of the alternates, really scary moment. This smile on this Invincible's face, eerie as hell. Another thing that's pretty immediately established is that though these Invincibles are still among the strongest beings on the planet, none of them are as strong as our version of Mark, which I think is not only pretty interesting on a narrative level for this story, but in terms of what it means for how unique our Mark actually is. From the limited scope we have of Invincible's multiverse, is there really any other dimension where Mark stayed loyal to Earth and his friends? Basically, every other Invincible we see is full-on evil, whether that's the one we see in Season 2's premiere, or through all of these alt-Invincibles in Angstrom's army. But that also means that through the events of our dimension, through maintaining loyalty to Earth, through taking the more righteous path, our Mark becomes stronger than he possibly could have in any other dimension, stronger than he possibly could have otherwise. Obviously, I don't think this means other Invincibles don't have that potential, but the fact is that the events of our Mark's universe, the burden of the responsibility to be Earth's primary defender against the Viltrum Empire, is what motivated Mark to become stronger than he would have in any other scenario, which makes a lot of sense. In the dimension where Mark teams up with his father, they would share the quote-unquote workload, and he likely wouldn't train as diligently. There is one of these evil Marks that claimed he killed his Omni-Man, which means that that version of Mark would have to be pretty strong, and obviously these Invincibles are all still stronger than most every hero on Earth, but I think this says a lot about our Mark and his trajectory as potentially one of the strongest beings in world history, across any dimension. Lots of the Invincibles in the Invincible War are taken down ultimately, which is pretty wild. Cecil manages to kill one with the murder cyborgs and that Tony used to incapacitate Mark earlier in the season. Darkwing banishes one to the Shadow Realm, sacrificing himself in the process. And then, of course, there's Rex. Okay, let's talk about Rex. Man, this guy has become one of my favorite characters over the course of the show. What a journey from pompous asshole to lovable idiot who means well. We got one more little Rex and Ray sequence as he starts helping her move into her new apartment, and we see their chemistry on full display before the Invincible War shit starts hitting the fan. I really loved that Rex adamantly told Ray to stay behind. It tracks that since this is basically Ray's first non-hero day, that her first instinct would still be to jump into action when needed, but Rex really cares about Ray, and insisting that she stick to her plan shows how much he understands her long-term needs. And damn, Rex puts up a serious fight against this Invincible at the Teen Team headquarters, allowing Bulletproof, Rudy, and Amanda to escape in the process. I was kind of shocked by how well Rex did in this fight, briefly incapacitating the Invincible before we get the ultimate sign of his growth across the series. It's a really sad sequence, but Rex's sacrifice, exploding his entire skeleton and destroying this Invincible in the process, was such a great moment. This season, Rex talked a lot about his identity as a hero and how he doesn't really feel he has one outside of being Rexplode. And so for him to sacrifice himself to save his friends and help protect the planet is a pretty great way to go out, in my opinion. Even though it is also kind of dark and sad. I'm really gonna miss the character though. Jason Mantzoukas gives a killer performance, and he's often some of the best comic relief in the entire series. It's a hole that's kind of tough to fill. I am, of course, assuming that he'll stay dead since we've had so many fake out deaths, but this feels pretty definitive. It would be pretty lame to undo this sacrifice. Ray's moment driving and seeing the explosion in the base and realizing what has likely happened is really affecting. This leads into probably the best sequence of the entire episode, just a really emotional music montage showcasing the combat and carnage across the globe, showing dead heroes, dead Invincibles, characters cowering and embracing each other in fear. I think this show tends to use music really effectively, and this is among my favorite examples across the entire series. Even the shots of the dead Invincibles feel sad. It just highlights how unfathomably dark this scenario is. And this leads to another really great scene in terms of Mark's struggles as a character this season. Earlier in the episode, Eve's leg is snapped brutally while she and Mark are attempting to fight two other Invincibles. It was among the hardest I've winced at anything in this show. And so after that montage, we see Mark sitting by Eve's side at the GDA hospital, and I think this is really emblematic of what Mark has been going through across this year. This season, we've seen Mark sort of refuse to answer the call a couple of times in favor of being with his loved ones and living his life. We saw it last week with the Powerplex dilemma. We saw it in episode 4 when he initially chose his date with Eve over helping the twins with their future dictator problem. Here's Mark amidst the biggest crisis the Earth has maybe ever seen, as the person who can make the biggest difference in fighting that crisis crisis, and he refuses to leave Eve's side. It's an age-old superhero question, but I like the way it's explored here. Can Mark make the right decision in terms of protecting the world if his priorities are actually the people he's closest to? Y'all play Spider-Man PS4? It's kind of along those lines of the big dilemma at the end of that game, when Peter had to make the choice not to use the antidote to save May so that they could replicate it and save the rest of New York. It's not new territory, but it is such a great conflict to throw these characters into emotional turmoil and really put their heroism to the test. It's kind of impossible to imagine the kind of mental fortitude it might take to leave your significant other unprotected like this, not knowing if you'll ever see them again. And I appreciate that Cecil is the one who tries to talk him into doing the right thing, trying to get it through to him that he not only knows what the right thing to do is, but that Eve would be wildly disappointed if Mark gave up his part in the fight on her account. But then we move on to day 3. The entire Invincible War started with a couple dozen Invincibles, and by day 3, there are actually only 8 left, which is pretty wild. The heroes who were left to defend Earth managed to take out way more of the Invincibles than I would have expected, like 2/3 of them potentially, and it's at this point that the rest are just fed up. I was wondering about this the entire time, how Angstrom managed to get this many Invincibles on board with his plan, and the answer is that he actually promised them all different things with no real intention on following up. This was all another interesting sequence showcasing the ways these Invincibles are all really different and have a variety of motivations and seemingly varying degrees of evilness. One of them just wants to see his mother again after she died in his dimension, which is a far cry from some of the others who claimed they gleefully killed Debbie in their own dimension. One just wants to see William again, but I think they play this right. It was already maybe a stretch that he'd be able to get this many Marks to cooperate, and this is where they just flat out stop. But Angstrom was of course prepared, stranding them in seemingly the same place where Mark thought he killed Angstrom in season 2. I cannot imagine that this is the last we've seen of these Invincibles either, so, eager to see when Chekhov's Invincibles fire. And this face-off between our Mark and Angstrom is a really great rematch. Angstrom has more at his disposal this time, seemingly being even more adept with his portals and utilizing the countless drones. Honestly, the way the drone swarms were animated was so cool. It's basically showcased like the gray goo hypothetical, except these bots aren't nano. It's kind of the same idea on a larger scale though. It just looks like a big glop of goo attacking Mark. And I love how the only real way Angstrom has to counteract Mark's strength is to outsmart and overwhelm him, which still doesn't work in the end. Mark breaking through the drones and reaching Angstrom is super satisfying. This event is going a really long way to make Mark question his own ideals. He outright says this later in the episode, so it's not like I'm doing any insane analysis here, but obviously he's been beating himself up about killing Angstrom since the end of season 2. And here he is, faced with the fact that by failing to kill Angstrom, he actually unleashed the absolute worst mass disaster in human history upon the planet. It's basically the exact same thing he was grappling with in regards to the Powerplex event, except scaled up times hundreds of thousands. He is faced with the unmistakable reality that if he had not failed to kill Angstrom, hundreds of thousands of people would still be alive. That is heavy. By trying to be the bigger, more righteous person, he inadvertently allowed mass murder to enter his dimension. But this moment where he catches up to Angstrom is where he's really faced with that reality and trying to determine what he needs to do now that he's got Angstrom in his hands, with Oliver screaming in his ear that he needs to end him. But Mark's reluctance lets Angstrom get away one more time, of course, except for one arm. I think it's pretty clear to just about anyone. The man that facilitated the destruction of every major city on the planet alongside hundreds of thousands of deaths, that guy should not be alive. It's a shame Mark realized this a little too late.
Angstrom did this because of me. I can't ignore that anymore.
Even though it's easy to see how and why Mark has struggled through this season, it's also really easy to pin a lot of blame on him during these events. Obviously, he didn't even realize that Angstrom was still alive, but his refusal to go out and help when Eve was in the hospital was wildly selfish. He may not have realized that hundreds of thousands were going to die, but he should have had an idea. It's a great personal dilemma for the show to put him through, and it feels like the purpose of his refusal was to further beat the idea into his head that he has to change how he operates if he's really serious about saving lives. His fear of losing Eve probably cost tens of thousands of people their lives. I mean, let's be honest though, I'm glad that's not a scenario I would ever have to make that important of a decision in, because Jesus Christ, I don't know if I'd be strong enough to even comprehend it. But as a viewer, It's pretty easy to say, come on, Mark, what the hell are you doing? I'm fascinated by the future of Angstrom because now he seems to be a pawn in the pocket of these technicians who, through their medical and tech revival of Angstrom, have basically installed tools of control and will now use him for their own gain. Not the direction I expected the Angstrom story to go, but one I'm very eager to see the next steps of. What's maybe craziest about this episode is that it feels fully like a season finale. This was such an insanely massive event, and they even spend a huge chunk of the end of the episode sort of wrapping things up as though it was a season finale. Mark goes to help Oliver and other folks clean up New York, only for Powerplex to lose his mind that he's willing to show his face. This is such a sad sequence as they just hold Scott down until he decharges, particularly because at this point, you know Mark truly understands and even agrees with Scott's POV. Mark finally meets Eve's parents as they visit her in the hospital, and we get a direct reference to the Adam Eve special. Mrs. Wilkins is basically conveying how they had always been terrified of Eve being a superhero out of fear for her safety, but she reveals that Eve's childhood friend, Valerie, actually died in these attacks. This is the character we saw Eve grow up with and confide in back in the Adam Eve special. It was her only real friend who then turned on her entirely when she discovered her abilities. Such a traumatizing thing to happen to a kid, especially a kid who has nobody else. But it's an interesting moment of decompression from Mrs. Wilkins, as she also reconciles with the fact that they have far less control than they'd like. Even though she thought it would be safer for Eve to stay out of all the fighting and conflict, plenty of people who did stay out of it lost their lives. Immortal is resurrected once again and decides to quit being a hero outright and wants to start a family with Kate, which leads to this truly huge moment. Cecil asks Mark to lead the Guardians of the Globe. An understandable request made maybe more out of desperation than anything, and a real long shot given Mark's frustrations with Cecil this season, but it's very interesting to see how their relationship has sort of halfway repaired. Mark still doesn't trust Cecil, but he does recognize the dire situation they're all in, the dire situation that Earth is in. He won't lead the Guardians, but he will answer the call if they really need him. Because at this point, what other choice do they have? The planet is in bad shape. But you see what I mean? All of these events, they really feel like end of the story cleanup moments. Obviously though, this is not the finale, because the events of these last 3 episodes of the season are just unrelenting. Enter Conquest. God, what an insane narrative decision this series makes. Unrelenting really is the only word. Mark deals with one of the most personally traumatizing events in his superhero career with Powerplex. Then the biggest disaster in world history immediately strikes the Earth in what turns out to be something that Mark fully blames himself for. There's a death toll in the hundreds of thousands because of this. And do things quiet down after that? Nah. Enter the strongest Viltrumite that exists, here for the explicit purpose of taking over Earth. What a show, man. I have actually seen the finale, and it is absolutely insane. I cannot wait to talk about it next week. I do not think y'all are ready, but what did y'all think about the Invincible War? How'd you feel about episode 7? Are you excited or just anxious for next week's finale? Let me know below in the comments, and stay tuned for next week's breakdown. Peace. Holy crap, what a finale. Am I right, folks? I mean, fresh on the heels of the Invincible War, Conquest arrives on Earth, and damn, does this whole thing just go so unbelievably hard. Picking up immediately where the previous left off, basically creating a biggest crisis in Earth history doubleheader. This one pits Mark against the strongest Viltrumite we've seen thus far, and certainly the strongest that we know about in the show. I'm looking at you, comic book spoilers, but this was one of the most stressful fights in the entire series. Not to mention just one of the coolest and most dynamic fights, to the point where I genuinely think the episode rivals the season 1 finale. And most importantly, the changes we see in Mark alongside the revelations about Eve and her capabilities have the potential to change everything about this series moving forward. And hey, if you like this, make sure to check out my breakdowns for every other episode of Invincible Season 3. I've had a lot of fun covering the show this year. Spoilers for the episode I thought you'd never show up ahead, and I just want to once again kindly ask y'all not to spoil the comics for anybody in the comments. Thank you. So, in an insane fashion, last week's episode ended not with the beginning of the cleanup of the Invincible War, but with the immediate arrival of Conquest to take over Earth for the Viltrum Empire. Truly a great cliffhanger, and what a fun villain Conquest is. Dude is just completely out of his mind. He doesn't even seem particularly attached to the Viltrum Empire, which I find really interesting. He's kind of just this sad titan of a man who only finds joy in, fittingly, the difficulty of his conquests. He literally says, "I'm here because I enjoy this. To me, there is no greater pleasure than feeling the warmth of my fists drenched in blood." And so while fighting Mark, he's less interested in just taking him out and more interested in egging him on until he actually has formidable moments in their battle. It's a fun dynamic, but definitely feels like Mark is desperately fighting for his life while Conquest toys with him, despite Mark getting some good licks in here and there. Also, probably a great time to rave about Jeffrey Dean Morgan as Conquest. He gives a genuinely incredible performance. I was honestly initially expecting that once they announced Jonathan Banks was in the cast that he would end up being Conquest, but he actually ended up voicing Britt, and it's hard to argue with the results. Morgan's performance is unreal and kind of a fun full circle Robert Kirkman-verse addition to the cast, given his Walking Dead fame, but there's just so much depth to this voice performance, such an amazing range of emotional deliveries from a character who is just unpredictably terrifying. I know I've also been critical of the animation over the course of the season, but maybe they were just saving the rest of their budget for this episode because this fight is truly masterful. Some of the best animation in the series for sure, just a harrowing, brutal, wild fight. Even some of the briefer moments are jaw-droppingly dark. Obviously, the destruction wrought on this city is massive in scale, but after Conquest drops from the sky and hammers Mark into the ground, there's a really quick shot of the skyline that shows most of the biggest skyscrapers starting to collapse from a result of the impact. I feel like people don't really grasp the weight of this kind of destruction. This is like 5 simultaneous 9/11s. Honestly, it's a little difficult to talk about this episode for prolonged periods of time because so much of it is just this incredibly long and dynamic fight sequence. It's in the city, it's in space, it's in South America, it's got so many great moments, but the variety of locations and big moments between Mark and Conquest make this episode a real joy to watch, despite also containing some of the most harrowing sequences. Though, and this is a full-on stereotypical nerdy nitpick, but do Viltrumites have the same shorthand illustration for hearts as we do on Earth? Because the moment where Conquest turns his frozen blood into a heart, it's absolutely ice cold, but also, does it make any sense at all? Did Conquest brush up on Earth's art history before he decided to invade? A pretty good moment that my dumb brain clashed with a little bit, but the most I held my breath during the episode was because of Oliver. Whew, God, did I feel for Debbie when she let him go help Mark, and honestly questioned the decision a bit, but I presume it's because Debbie realized that she wasn't ever going to be able to keep Oliver from going to try and help, and that she'd rather give him this advice that she left him with and give them a nice moment together before he runs off into danger. But her cries after he leaves are so brutal and so sad. My God, when Conquest turns his focus to Oliver though, and he holds him above his head, telling him he's gonna rip him in half and eat his heart, I really thought that was it for Oliver. I was watching through my fingers, dreading the result, and I'm so glad that this is not how Oliver goes out. That would have been just an absolutely jaw-droppingly dark way to end his life. And I also really feel for Mark, who just desperately tried to get Oliver out of there before being forced to watch his brother nearly be torn in half. Really glad he managed to save him. And Mark going absolutely nuts to protect his loved ones is a real common thread in this episode, but we will get there. It's a big part of the episode later. Honestly, this moment in South America that starts on the beach where Conquest just drives Mark through countless people, absolutely brutalizing them, tearing them in half, it's arguably more insane than Nolan's train shenanigans in the season 1 finale. Unbridled horror. This guy is a true monster. I mentioned this earlier, but Conquest is such a fascinating villain here. He basically lays out that even amongst Viltrumites, he's sort of an outlier. He has absolutely no real meaningful connections. He's used as this weapon of mass destruction that goes planet to planet conquering, and even as he gets better and better at it and continues to help the Empire fulfill their goals, he isn't more respected, he's more feared, further marginalized from his own people. There's this moment where he whispers that he is genuinely lonely, that he has no friends, and it's just such an interesting way to paint nuance over the seemingly straightforward killing machine. This man knows nothing but murder, not because it's all he cares about, but because it's basically all the Empire allows of his existence. And so he embraces it as his only real reason to live, and because he's really damn good at it. Obviously, after the events of the Invincible War, the Earth's defense is really fully compromised. They've got next to nobody who can meaningfully help in this moment. Honestly, looking at you, Immortal, I understand wanting to call it quits with the heroism thing, but not being willing to help here, the moment after you quit, is really cowardly. You're not going to have an Earth to live on. I do want to talk about the ramifications of this Cecil Sinclair GDA reveal, the reveal that Cecil and Sinclair are trying to turn the invincible corpses from the Invincible War into reanimen, which I'm sure Mark is going to be super chill about when he finds out. Obviously, it seems like they've only recovered a few invincible bodies to use here, but a horde of reanimen already managed to kill a couple of Marks themselves, and in groups, they seem to be amongst the strongest and most formidable things on the planet. At least 3 invincible reanimen? Not only is this undoubtedly going to cause a massive conflict with Mark, but I think it's also just a complete necessity for Earth's protection in this moment, knowing the dangers posed by the potential Viltrumite invasion and the decreasing formidable defense options. Again, looking at you, Immortal, I just don't think there's any other option that the GDA knows about in this moment. Obviously, they might actually have Nolan, Allan, and potentially more defecting Viltrumites to help, but the GDA has no idea that this is a possibility, so I'm pretty eager to see if Mark's new attitude post-Season 3 will help him overcome the issues he would obviously have with Cecil using the corpses of his dead alternate selves to create loyal soldiers for the GDA. But the other huge asset they're going to have is Adam Eve, and this is an episode that finally starts to reveal the absolutely massive potential of her abilities, and the fact that she is genuinely one of the strongest beings that exists. Even while injured and recovering, Eve wakes up and insists on being sent into the field to help Mark, and I think this episode is again another great extension of what we've seen from their relationship so far. They are so committed to one another, and they cannot comprehend putting themselves first. They both go so far out of their way to protect and support one another, and in both instances, they motivate each other to be stronger. Even before the big Eve moment in this episode, she puts up an outrageously good fight against Conquest. Even though she's not as physically strong as Mark and can't take as many hits, the way she fights Conquest is arguably much more impressive and wildly creative. It was so sick to see her really showcase her potential against the absolute strongest opponent we've seen so far, primarily in defense of Mark. This stuff absolutely rules. Of course, as I mentioned, she isn't as physically strong, so when Conquest does finally get to her, this is another massive wince moment from me. Unfathomable brutality here. And again, this is something we've seen going all the way back to Season 1. When Mark sees those he cares about in danger, it fully shifts him into an entirely new gear. Even though he has been absolutely pummeled into submission by Conquest, believing that Eve is gone completely drives him into sicko mode, destroying Conquest's mechanical arm and just somehow continuing to stay in this fight when it seems like he should have been down and out multiple times by now. But I love this idea that Mark and Eve together are sort of this unstoppable tag team, motivating one another to take it to the next level each and every time. Because now we get this full-on Super Saiyan Adam Eve moment, harkening back to what we saw in her special when she was younger. The extent of what her abilities are capable of. She can rearrange matter, and in this moment, she literally rearranges her own matter, healing her critical wounds, and then full-on microwaving Conquest. Insanely sick moment. It's wild how similar and yet contextually different these final battle moments are between seasons 2 and 3. Basically both showcasing Mark absolutely unleashing his fury on his opponent in a gruesome display of violence, both in defense of loved ones, this time using only his face, by the way. But the difference is, last season, Mark pointedly did not intend to kill Angstrom Levy, but I don't think there's any question that, at this moment, he is trying to kill Conquest. We've seen how his ideals have shifted over the course of the season. Slowly, each new dilemma Mark was confronted with forced him to reconcile with scenarios where the answer was to kill. After the Invincible War in last week's episode, he was finally ready to acknowledge that killing Angstrom would save more lives, only for the opportunity to slip through his hands. And here, in the Season 3 finale, there is no question that Mark is not remotely holding back. He does not even hesitate. He is trying to kill this dude. And I don't think I can even show you what his face ends up looking like when he's done with him. And it's kind of a bittersweet thing, to be honest, because while, yes, Mark is reaching a potential that very well may save the planet, he's also being forced to betray and abandon a belief system that he truly held dear, one that I think was a sign of him desperately trying to hold on to his humanity, mostly out of his fear that he would become too much like his father, too Viltrumite. I made an entire video about this fear and trajectory for Mark and Nolan after Season 2, still proud of that, go check it out if you haven't, but most importantly, these events, and particularly the changes we see in Mark and Eve, truly change everything for the future of Invincible. Mark literally tells Oliver that he was right, that he needs to be willing to kill in order to protect others. A far cry from where he was at the beginning of the season. He is no longer holding back, the gloves are off, he's untethered, he's ready to go. And I expect this change will be reflected not only in his crime fighting and hero work, but probably in his attitude as well. The question is, will Mark be able to hold on to that humanity while entertaining this significant change in attitude, becoming a little more ruthless? Will he be able to continue to prevent those deep-seated fears that he'll become his father. He's effectively admitting that he needs to be judge, jury, and executioner if necessary, which was largely a huge part of the issue Mark had with Nolan's attitude towards Earth and its citizens, that he was above them and therefore his choices held more weight and theirs didn't matter. Now, obviously, we should all trust Mark a lot more on a moral level than we do Nolan, but I think it's a particularly interesting direction after he also went through the whole Powerplex dilemma, a scenario where Mark realized that his own decision-making in the heat of a crisis moment had a huge trickle effect that continued the cycle of death and destruction. I mean, looking at the season 1 finale fight and the season 3 finale fight, there is no reason that this latest finale couldn't have created a dozen more Powerplexes. I guess ultimately Mark feels that by nipping that kind of destruction in the bud and actually being willing to end that life before it can take more will prevent that trickle-down trauma. It's just a bit of a dangerous tightrope walk, because if Mark is that much more willing to kill, is that much more willing to be judge, jury, and executioner, there is much less room for error. And if he f***s it up, he might just be seen by the world as another killer Invincible, just like his alternate brethren. Might just be seen as another Viltrumite, like Conquest and like his father. He has to truly avoid mistakes at all costs if he wants to maintain public favor and be able to continue to protect the planet. Eve's evolution here is also clearly a huge game changer. She's always been incredibly powerful, but the fight against Conquest truly showed another level of her capabilities, even before the full ability unlock that altered her own molecular structure. And I am so eager to see how Eve starts to exercise these abilities beyond what we've seen, and if we should expect her to continue to train in a way that levels her up to another absolute top-tier metahuman. But the thing I'm maybe expecting a bit more concernedly is that Cecil is absolutely going to want to try and tap in and take advantage of the limitless potential of Eve's unblocked abilities. The ability to manipulate, create, and change matter just creates far too many possibilities for him to ignore it. The GDA is already capable of so much, and Eve can basically do any of what they do with a snap of her fingers when her abilities are unchecked. It's a time and money saver on an unbelievable level. The rest of this episode does a ton of narrative cleanup, kind of like the end of the last episode, except it really is the finale this time. Eve opens up to Mark about the extent of her abilities and the blocks and why she survived. Debbie understandably spirals about the lives that her children are living and how unfair it is that so much is foisted upon them. Mark straight up tells Cecil to burn Conquest's body, which, okay Mark, you know Cecil, you should have watched them burn that body. We'll get to that later. And then we get to see Rex's funeral as well. Before we get to the emotion of this scene, which I like, I have to apologize for once again griping about the animation, but the juxtaposition of this episode going from the absolutely unreal execution of the Conquest fight to this, bro, half of these characters are straight up copy pasted from their model sheets. This is the kind of corner cutting that really bums me out. Not even gonna give these characters like a mournful hand folded pose like they managed for Rudy and Amanda, just straight faced forward staring. Rough, man. But I do love the emotion behind this scene and the way they stop to honor Rex. Honestly, Rex had such a great sort of sleeper arc in my opinion. He was obviously very hateable at first and he never really strayed too far from that big personality that made him stand out. But over these 3 seasons, he slowly adjusted his more core actions in a way that showed growth and endeared him to the audience. If any character's death deserves a full scene to honor them, I think it's this one. I will say though, I kinda hate that Rudy decided to change his name to Rex. Dude already non-consensually cloned Rex and put himself in the body, and I kinda think that just fully adopting his name now as well is more disrespectful than it is respectful. Just putting all the finishing touches on your long con identity theft, Rudy? But Eve's speech was the kind of short and sweet emotional punch that I really love in this show, as she tearfully and mournfully says that Rex was her first everything, good and bad, and that's all she can even manage. Honestly, it's all she needed to say. You fully understand the complex emotions Eve is feeling. They've fully experienced every emotion together. He was one of her first real confidants and partners. They grew together as heroes, and he was also someone who fully betrayed her trust and won it back. I love her conversation with Mark after this as well, where she talks about how much he changed and how much she laments that she didn't get to spend more time with him. I also love this scene in terms of Mark and Eve's relationship. There are so many dudes who would just be so jealous over their girlfriends saying that they wished they'd spent more time with their ex, but Eve and Mark have so much trust in each other, and Mark understands what Eve and Rex's relationship was. This also leads to a really sweet moment where Mark fittingly smiles at Eve simply because he's just so happy and relieved that she's even alive. And it's kind of the first time that he expresses to her that he really thought she was dead. That is pretty heavy. I know this is an action show, and so many fans are a little impatient when it comes to sitting through character stuff before the more plot-driven action, but I don't think the show works without these kinds of well-written and nuanced relationship dynamics. The action doesn't mean anything if the characters' relationships don't matter to us. The remainder of the episode does some pretty fun table setting, and like, sort of a lot of it, maybe too much. Even right at the end of this really intimate scene where Eve helps Mark into bed, we see that his costume that she matter manipulated off of him seems to be melting into this pink goo, which I expect is definitely related somehow to Eve's abilities and her Super Saiyan episode from the Conquest fight. Really no idea what it means, but very curious. We get a new cliffhanger with the Sequids revealing that they seem to be amassing some head crab zombies in the sewer, which sounds like exactly what Earth needs to deal with post-Invincible War and Conquest. Never a break, is there? Battle Beast awakens from his space hibernation. God knows what he's gonna get up to next season. He's actually also got a whole new comic book miniseries releasing this year at some point, which makes me curious if they'll also be doing some sort of special for him in the future. I'd really like to see that, honestly. Angstrom is given a new mechanical arm by the technicians, who throw out some heavy dimensional takeover implications. It's going to be really interesting to see how they intend to use Angstrom and his powers for their own goals, and these dudes overall seem pretty formidable. And of course, and I fully blame Mark for not following through on this, Cecil has kept Conquest alive in a bunker prison 6 miles underground with seemingly enough fail-safes to make sure he doesn't escape, but like, why are you tempting fate, bro? I do understand wanting to extract as much info about Viltrum as possible, but dude, this guy killed so many people so fast. And then our post-credit scene is our old friend Damien Darkblood, a guy I like, but low-key forgot about, if I'm being honest. And if I'm being even more honest, I did not love this as a post-credit scene. I like Darkblood, and it was cool to see him again, but I think as a final beat, this lacked the punch you'd want from a final note for a season. A far cry from I Think I Miss My Wife, for sure. But I am being told that this scene is apparently 100% original to the animated series and was never in the comic books, which I guess makes it a bit more understandable why it was saved for the post-credit scene, an indication that this show is really trying to expand beyond the scope of the comics. But it also just feels like a lot of new things to be table setting after an already wildly busy season that has a bunch of untouched table settings still. But overall, this finale really rips. I genuinely think it rivals the season 1 finale as one of the best episodes of the show, and this season as a whole I think stands pretty firmly alongside season 1. I don't think season 2 is a particularly big step down either. The show is consistently great, but I also think this season's themes permeate all of the stories in a really impressive way. Mark's journey, questioning his own ideals and what is required from him to be the best hero he can be, stems really beautifully from the trauma he endured at the end of season 2, and it plays out in such a natural escalation. Each new event attacks those ideals from a slightly different angle, forcing him to not just question whether or not his moral high ground is in fact a high ground, but also to examine his own shortcomings/failures and reconcile with the way those have negatively affected others. He's forced to recognize that he doesn't have it all figured out, and that he also has hurt people via his actions even when he thinks he's doing the right thing, and that he might not have the freedom or flexibility to take such an idealistic approach when the lives of others rest with his decision making. And the icing on the cake is that so many of the subplots and side stories of the season also deal within these themes. I really think this is just such a thematically rich season of television, even if I maybe thought it had a bit of a pacing problem. But Invincible remains one of my favorite shows on TV. Its success is such a huge deal for the future of adult animation and its extension beyond the comedy genre, and I cannot wait to see what else they do in this world. I personally am really hoping we do see more specials in the future. I think that Adam Eve special is so great and underrated, and the world is so vast. It feels like there are dozens of opportunities to do more specials, and I think over the next month or so, I'd really like to make character videos focusing on Rex and maybe one focusing on Eve, though there's obviously going to be a lot more of Eve coming up, so I might hold off. But let me know if that's something you'd be interested in. And also, please let me know what you thought about this finale and this season of Invincible as a whole. Thanks for tuning into these breakdowns this year. I had a lot of fun covering the show, and I'll catch you soon. Peace.
I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust a move.